Okay, I'm going to talk about the governmental factors that attribute to the financial crisis of the 2008 financial crisis and also the 1997 Asian financial crisis. As we all know that in the 2008 financial crisis and the causes, like the fundamental causes of the financial crisis, the bank are willing to make risky loans, which makes a lot of like bad debts in the public. So, from the governmental aspect, the bank are willing to make risky loan because the Clinton administration pressure on the banks that help poor people become homeowners and noble liberal ideas that banks are willing to like borrow more money to the public. And on the other hand, the Clinton Justice Department threatened banks with lawsuit and fines for redlining that if they didn't make this known, so like they forced the bank to borrow the monies to the public. And also the ARCON, which is Obama's community service organization, was instrumental in providing borrowers and pressuring the banks to make these loans. Moreover, the President Clinton also reduced the Fannie Mae's reserve requirement to 2.5%, which means it could purchase or guarantee $97.5 in mortgage for every $2.5 is an inequality to cover possible bad debts. So the government is a kind of like support the bank to borrow, so as to like they try to repay the bank if there are any bad debts in certain extents, which leads to the bank are more willing to risky loans, and this is caused by the government policy and the government decision. On the other hand, at the same time, the Federal Reserve kept the interest rate artificially low. Monthly mortgage payments were low, and the housing prices went up, and many homeowners got their home equity loans to pay their first mortgage and credit card debts. So basically, is they turn down the interest rate, which makes the borrowing trend is more vigorous. And lastly, because they use fiscal stimulus in this financial crisis, and which is also kind of like support by the government, and indeed, from some research, is that the concept of fiscal stimulus is kind of wrong, and that also have a toxic effect on economy. And the logic is that usually the workers produce goods and services, and they try to earn the money on the living expenses. But the fiscal stimulus try to give money to the public, which increase the capital goods spending instead of a normal spending like the living spending, and it's kind of relocate the spending away from the healthy growing business to a failing business. So this kind of weakening the economy, which caused the bubbles that people are like more willing to buy the capitals goods, so like kind of invest or try to spend in other ways instead of like the healthy economic activities. So in the 1997, there are also government factors that attribute to the crisis, which is quite similar. That government do like a similar job in the interest rate or exchange rates or the policy stuff like this. In 1997 financial crisis, there's a prolonged maintenance of pegged exchange rate, which is a kind of in an unsustainable levels, which complicate the response of monetary policy to overheating pressure, which indeed encouraging the external borrowing and lead to excessive exposure to foreign exchange risks in both financial and corporate sectors. On the other hand, as we all know that there is no enforcement of prudential rules and inadequate supervision of financial system, coupled with the government direct lending practice that led to a sharp deterioration in quality of banks. So basically, there is no rules to kind of like to quality control the bank's loan portfolios. Lastly, the problems of government and also political uncertainties at that time that worsened the crisis of confidence, which makes the foreign creditors to roll over short-term loans and lead to a downward pressure on the currency and stock market, which kind of like tackle down the stock market. As you all can see that the government factors have attributed a lot in the financial crisis, and these are the factors in respectively in the Asian financial crisis and also the 2008 global financial crisis. Thank you.
Okay, then we move on to talk about the central bank's monetary policy. And I'm going to cover the 1997 Asian financial crisis as well as the 2008 credit crisis. And I'm going to compare these monetary policies in these two crises. Let's start from 1997 Asian financial crisis. At the beginning, before the speculators launched attacks on the currencies, actually there are five countries that pegged their exchange rate to the US dollar. They include Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, Korea, and also Hong Kong SAR. And therefore, the central banks, they are responsible to keep the exchange rate at a stable level against the US dollar. However, when the speculators they launch the speculative attacks, the market are flooded with the Asian currencies, and the central banks no longer stabilize the exchange rate against US dollar because they are running out of reserves, and therefore they can only give up the pegged exchange rate and let the currency float, and led to a rapid depreciation of the currency. To avoid further depreciation of currency, the central banks they adopted a higher short-term interest rate in order to avoid speculative attacks of the currency. However, some people criticize that this interest rate increase will discourage borrowing and investment of banks and other firms, and this further hits the economy. Moreover, the speculators they can also continue their attacks on the stock market. Therefore, the interest rate increase is actually not very successful in protecting the economy. And then we move on to talk about the 2008 crisis. After the outbreak of credit crisis in 2008, the Federal Reserve they faced a very serious economic recession, and the Fed decided to cut the interest rate so that they can increase the money supply and stimulate the economic growth. However, it is not very successful because by the end of 2008, the Fed funds rate was already nearly zero, and they cannot further cut the interest rate. In response, the Federal Reserve they issued quantitative easing to stimulate the economic growth. It is injection of money to the economy by buying mortgage-backed securities, treasuries, as well as bank debts. After the QE1, the Federal Reserve already held $2.1 trillion of these assets. Comparing the monetary policies in these two crises, we see that there are actually very different monetary policy adopted. For the 1997 Asian financial crisis, the central banks they focus on stabilizing the exchange rate, while in the 2008 credit crisis, the U.S. central bank they focus on stimulate the economy. And the Asian central banks, they adopt contractionary monetary policies to avoid their currencies further devalue. While in the 2008 credit crisis, the central U.S. central banks, they adopt as expansionary monetary policies to stimulate the economic growth. And this is the end of the monetary policy part.
After that, we would like to compare the banks' behavior in the two crises. In both the Asian financial crisis and the credit crisis in 2008, banks and other financial institutions take too much risks. The excessive risk-taking shares several similar reasons. Before the Asian financial crisis, East Asian governments had a close relationship with the banks and other companies, so the banks believed that they were under the protection of the government. This phenomenon is called crony capitalism. Since the interest rate in foreign countries were relatively low, and the loans to the banks seem to be implicitly guaranteed by the government due to the crony capitalism. A lot of credit available from abroad. So, the banks borrow money from foreign countries and make loans in the local market and earn the interest difference. They are less prudent and tended to originate high-risk loans with the easy credit. How about the 2008 credit crisis? In this crisis, there is also easy credit. After the Asian financial crisis, the Asian countries transformed themselves from less borrowers to less lenders. They were said to be a global saving club. Since the Asian country provides so many capital in the capital market, the interest rate in the United States kept dropping, so the cost of investment became very low. It gave rise to the excessive risk-taking behaviors of the banks. In the crisis, two of the first innovators of the mortgage-backed securities were Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, which were government-sponsored enterprises, GSE. They were believed to be protected by the U.S. government, so that what they issued tended to be safe. As a result, the MBS are very popular and was regarded as a very good investment item. The banks, including commercial banks and investment banks, turned them into a very big business in which risks were underestimated.